I grew up in a fundamentalist evangelical church and household whose slogan was the Bible, the whole Bible, and nothing but the Bible. So I grew up with text as something that was often used. It was always meant to be taken literally, and we ignored any cognitive dissonance about the fact that it's impossible to take it literally. And for me, I ended up, after I came out the first time as a lesbian and in a relationship with a woman, I started to really grapple with this text and think, you know, I have to explain these passages that are used to condemn gay people. And my faith went from being a really kind of emotional faith to being very intellectual. And I had to intellectualize these texts. And it was in the midst of that I found myself in seminary where, I mean, it's all intellectual work. But I no longer had kind of the spiritual backing to feel connected to God anymore. It was all intellectualized, and that was really difficult. And I was finding that often people were using the Bible in one of two ways. They were using it as a sword to kind of attack other folks, or they were using it as a shield to protect themselves from those attacks. And we weren't getting anywhere. And I was in an exegesis class, which is basically just a fancy word for unpacking the text so you can preach it. And we were talking about the story of doubting Thomas. And it's a story where Jesus has been crucified and the disciples are gathered together in a room and they're really depressed. And Thomas isn't with them. And Jesus appears to them and everyone's really happy. And then he disappears again and Thomas comes back and they tell Thomas, well, you missed him. And Thomas is like, well, unless I see the wounds in his hand and put my finger in his side, I won't believe that he's been resurrected. And then Jesus kind of appears again, and Thomas is there, and Jesus says, well, look, you can touch my hands and my side. And Thomas, without touching, falls on his knees and says, my Lord and my God. And Jesus replies, you know, you believe because you have seen me, but blessed are those who have not seen and yet still believe. And in my tradition growing up, that was always used to pat ourselves on the back, that we had never seen Jesus and yet we still believed, and aren't we special? But in that moment of sitting in my seminary classroom, I had been transitioning by this point for about a year, very publicly, felt on display, and had this moment where I thought, I understand Jesus in this situation of like, when I tell people that I'm trans, the first question, well, have you had the surgery yet? What do your scars look like? Can you show me your body? And it was that moment for me that the light went on, and I thought, I can encounter this text again. And I can put my own experience central to the text. And it was that moment that I was able to reclaim the text as something that was sustaining and life-giving. And that has changed everything for me, and has really changed how I do theology. And I want to read some of the stuff that I've written around text. Particularly, I looked at Jesus' passion narrative. So from the moment of the transfiguration, which is basically where he glows on top of the mountain, and I call that kind of Jesus' big coming out moment, up through, and it's very sparkly, which is great, up through the resurrection. I've really kind of written that out as a trans narrative. I'm going to share a little bit of that today. But kind of the guiding part of my work comes from Dr. Patrick Chang. He's a queer theologian. And he has in his book, Radical Love, which is a systematic queer theology, this quote that I'd like to share. Before this, he's shared other definitions of queer. And he says, the second meaning of queer is a self-conscious embrace of all that is transgressive of societal norms, particularly in the context of sexuality and gender identity. In fact, this term is best understood as a verb or an action. That is, to queer something is to engage with a methodology that challenges and disrupts the status quo. Like the function of the court jester or the subversive traditions of Mardi Gras, to queer something is to turn convention and authority on its head. It is about seeing things in a different light and reclaiming voices and sources that previously have been ignored, silenced, or discarded. And for me, I think the beauty of sacred text is when we queer a sacred text, we put ourselves central, and we are no longer silenced or marginalized.